conference. We are at our last day, and we today have a lecture presentation by Noa Treister. Did I pronounce it correctly? Noa is living currently in Belgrade, but she's in the neighborhood in Jaši. So we are happy to have her here. She's an artist, curator, and activist whose work is dedicated to articulation of various possibilities of economic and political relations and schism in society, in this country. She's going to tell us something about what she did recently, but actually I suppose this constitutes the majority of your activity. The reading groups, the discussion of the reading groups, privileges and identities, rights and property will focus on two aspects. The first, why reading common, how are reading groups a political activity, and the second, how to make the concretity of a reading group in general, and why do they choose the topics of rights and properties. I will not read all the introduction. This was more for us to know you, because this is also the first time that we meet. So I'll let you the mic and let's start.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for having me here. With Florin and Livia and Andre and other people from Yash and Transit, we are doing this reading group and general projects about privileges and identities. And I was asked to present it here. Although it's a wider project that includes also an exhibition and so on, Florin will talk about it a little bit later. My part in it is mainly the reading groups, and this is I've been holding reading groups since for the last something like 15 years. So this is a very interesting and medium or activist practice that I've experienced with quite a long time, and found really quite interesting ways of communicating, because I think that the question of reading is very, let's say, we take it too much for granted. When we talk about reading groups, we usually talk about theoretical material that somehow, as we think of ourselves as intellectuals and activists, we kind of feel that we should know or not know, or that can help us. And this is very, and then we kind of follow the normal, the discourse, without really thinking what constitutes reading, and where it comes from. Last year I came first time to Yash by invitation of another friend, activist, Nebusha Milikic, and of course by invitation of Florin and Livia to do a reading group about the middle class. which was very successful. But what was interesting is that the process of thematizing the reading group, who is the one who actually articulates what is the theme of the reading group, and who are the participants. Because, for instance, in one of the NGOs I work in, we work with the workers. And a few years ago there was an occupation of a cinema in Belgrade, Zvezda. And there three groups of people came together to perform this political act, and one was a group of activists, the other was filmmakers, and the third was the workers who actually worked in this firm that was privatized, and they were still in a legal struggle with the firm. And it was very interesting because when we sat with all this group, you could see that there are three different, although of course everybody was speaking Serbian, so in terms of real language, it was the same language. There were three distinct languages that each of these positions used. And while the activist came from a position of, let's say, a political statement, which meant that they occupied the space, wanted to make a point about privatizations, about who is making decision, who is the decision-making actors in society today, anti-capitalist story. The filmmakers actually took it from a position of making some sort of cultural center in which they were not, they wanted it to work, but at the level of their capacity, develop it as much as they can, and as we know how many artist groups take over space. But the workers actually thought about it as an enterprise, as the thing they knew before, which included a whole system and structure of experts or qualified workers operating the technology, a director, a project director, program director, person who sells the tickets, the whole system of social relation that works in the enterprise. So for me it was a very telling moment where you actually had to become a translator between three different languages. And each of these groups had a totally different reading of the situation, even though they kind of participated in the same act. So reading is much more than just the act of a transfer of information. It's all the time a process of communication and negotiation between oneself and somebody who is totally other. And this we have to take into account because we very easily miss these misreadings. Because we don't, when we in postmodernism talk about the other, it's always somebody who is either from a different nationality, religion, somebody who is a victim of something. but the other is here, between us. And it's really important, not only, this was a unique situation because even though we don't account for it, we do these exclusions all the time. We're only speaking to the converted. And it's very difficult, working with very different communities of war veterans, refugees before the last wave of refugees. I'm talking of refugees from the Yugoslav wars, workers. To hear reading is just to hear the different languages that each of us speaks, and to be all the time in the process of translation. And now, when we are aware of this, then we can actually start reading real text, theoretical text, from a totally different position. Now, we are now living in a system of neoliberalism that totally flattens all these kind of speeches, acts of speech. So when Margaret Thatcher said to us, there is no alternative to capitalism, she didn't only mean that the social bloc will fall, even though it was way before it actually fell, but also that we are now constituting a very specific and exclusive social relation. The only social relation that today capitalism allows between people is competition. And you can have what we call cooperation. Usually is a kind of finding people who have the same interests and speak the same language, and then we can cooperate. But to actually start cooperating with the other is very complex, because this kind of it's not nuances, this kind of different languages have to all the time be negotiated. So when we work with workers, we give, for instance, our organization gives free legal help to workers still still fighting privatization. Reading with them philosophical texts is a total different process than reading with art students or with philosophers or other academics or just people who are left-wingers or something like that. And it's a difficulty you have to politically be committed to. It's not something that will happen on its own. So when we take a situation like you are now investigating in the sense of neighborhoods and kind of territorial areas, especially in post-socialist countries, it's a very mixed population. And if you want to do something that, you have to take very active measures to include everybody. Because if we talk about, if we actually want to, not only, for instance, a misunderstanding that is often happens is the term materialism. Read as out of Marxism, what we call historical materialism is the set of social relations and conditions that makes a certain situation. Read from, let's say, a middle class, well-meaning left activism. It means community empowerment and giving people better living conditions. Now this is sometimes it's only a nuance in reality. But if we want to make a real change in this kind of territorial situation, then we actually have to examine with the people their own material conditions where they are coming from. And with them make a plan how to change it. It's not a question of bettering the situation, but it's a question of how do these people get more decision power over their own situations, whatever they might be. And this is, from this analysis of the material conditions and the social relations, this is where the observation of what are the themes that are important to read come from. So coming from let's say from Yugoslavia, from the countries that succeeded Yugoslavia, and coming from Israel. Initially, I'm from Israel. Then the human rights discourse today is very acts as a paradigm, but we actually see that it's not functioning. And on the other hand, we see that one of the projects I was doing was working with war veterans, a project called first Naming It War, and then Testimony, Truth or Politics. So so in these projects we did a lot of activities, but in the as part of it, we were discussing the question of testimony, because we made interviews with a lot of war participants, and one of the women who testified, she was actually she was a judge before the war, and she was actually in one of the worst camps in Prijedor in Bosnia. And after the interview, she kind of reflected on her own testimony, and she said, I'm not a victim, I'm a warrior. She said, I'm fighting for the truth. And then I asked her, but do you think that your testimony is political? And she said, no, 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 no. And of course she thinks of party politics, not on political in the Marxian sense, but she said truth and dignity and rights cannot be part of politics. And that made me think, I mean, this is the essence of politics. What is the discourse, what is the reading that allows us to depoliticize the act of testimony when Primo Levi, for instance, speaks of the fact that the best historians of the camps were the people who were the anti-fascists because they were politically educated and because they knew that their testimony is a political act. Now this is where, from this kind of observations, and also here in this area, even though, or before coming to Serbia, I lived in Prague, in post-socialist countries, the whole human rights discourse was so distinctively anti-communist and created the whole anti-communist discourse that totally erased the wide range of actually human rights that were gained through communism. So actually, and this, it's funny because this critique was actually already articulated, and we read this text last year by Marx in his essay about the Jewish question. This critique of the idea of rights, because he says rights is part of a political system in which the person becomes abstract. You have rights, it's a property, right is a property. So you turn, you don't have a life, you have a right to have a life. And that doesn't, and the whole distinction between political emancipation and human emancipation. So this is basically all these observation and difficulties to kind of read reality or to ask yourself what is activism in this situation that we are in, led us to choose the idea of the theme of rights and to a little bit investigate what is beyond, because all the time, for instance, the activist scene that I know for at least the last 40 years, it's always the situation of the individual and the state. And we think that we all the time are creating it, but actually, no. There is a theoretical called Samuel Moyn who actually shows that human rights in the sense that we know them today of supporting civil society or activists against the state, including the dissidents, what we call in the 70s and 80s in socialist countries. This is a new paradigm, because after the Second War, human rights were part of the state building of the welfare state in the West. part of the of state building as part of the anti-colonial struggle in colonized countries. So it was part of the state discourse. This kind of international human rights supported by international organization of individual within state against their own state, it's a phenomenon that developed in the 70s. So, and now we have, and he created the whole, of course, scandal in this kind of history, because till now there was a discourse that put a linear line, historical line of human rights from the ancient Greeks to today based on natural rights, which is also very problematic, and the whole discourse of what is natural and how did we come from natural right to biological extermination in Nazism? That's also a very big question. So, and you know, when people now blame, for instance, Stalin for the Holodomor in Ukraine, for the hunger in Ukraine, then you ask yourself, oh, wonderful, but what is happening in Eastern Europe in the last 20 years? How many people displaced? How did the length of life drop for almost 20 years? You know, was that so different? I remember being in Prague in 2004 when he joined the EU, and I remember how Western politicians were proud on how they were getting 10 new countries so cheaply. So, I mean, when we equivalent Stalinism and Nazism, where is colonialism? We missed some 700 years there, I think. So the idea that led, and of course, following the wars in Yugoslavia, the main discourse today is about how there was this, out of nowhere came this crazy guy called Milosevic who somehow managed to convince all the Serbs to one day get up and kill their neighbors. That's basically the discourse, and now to remedy the situation, we will get all the war criminals. But somewhere in the process, we forgot that that everybody lost, and that the area that this socialist state that, with all its fault, I'm not now glorifying Yugoslavia, but with all its fault, created 50 years of peace, created a working class that was proud of itself, and that invested in their own factories, and that had human dignity, and that did not see each other as competitors. It created a very unique system of property called socially owned property, which was in the beginning of the 80s declared unsustainable. But somehow this how much it was unsustainable. And this idea of socially owned property is 100 times more sophisticated than this commons idea that is now discussed. But it's taboo. You cannot speak about it in Yugoslavia today. And for instance, in this last project of Testimony, Truth of Politics, we had a traveling exhibition that was presented in 5 countries, but among one of the major places was Sarajevo in Bosnia. And there was a huge coverage of media coverage for this exhibition, and there was no media that I didn't say to them, the Yugoslav wars were for the robbery of the socially owned property, and nationalism was only a tool. Only Al Jazeera published its own portal. Not one television, not one newspaper. But this is something that each veteran, each war veteran, it doesn't matter from which country, or from which religion, or from which ethnic group, when they came back to closed factories, they know that. So where is the break in the reading? You know, where this is the reading of Yugoslav wars that does not allow to talk about, and there is no history of who profited from the war. I mean, in Yugoslavia, of course, it's more dramatic because there was a war and people got killed and there were camps and there were massacres and so on. But it's more or less was in all post-socialist countries. I mean, more people immigrated from Yugoslavia after the wars than during the wars. How many people emigrated from here? How many people live today in Romania, in Moldova, in wherever, from the remittances paid by gastarbeiters in different countries? And this is and now, okay, so we have a very complicated situation. What do we do? This is where the reading groups come in. So one version of reading group is the one that we now will be doing in Yash next week. And the end of June, and this is really reading philosophical texts. We will read Kant and Hannah Arendt and Hegel and Marx and so on. But I wanted to show you another another version of a reading group. But first I'll give Florian the floor for a few minutes to tell you how this reading group functioned within this whole project of privileges and identities, the exhibition and who is invited and so on. And I will prepare now. Okay.
So hello, my name is Florin Bobu. and I'm working with a group of people in Iași with two organizations which co-organize this project, which is called Drepturi, Libertăți, Privilegii, Rights, Liberties and Privileges. The project is run so it's organized by 1+1 organization and tranzit.ro, and is financed by a governmental organization called Administration of the National Cultural Fund. For us, it is very important to say that we build projects around a specific issue that comes in our dialogue with various actors in the cultural scene. And as we met Noa during the project of last year, she was invited by one of our collaborators, Neboj Šambilikić, and we kind of sensed that she could help us advance in what we first attempted to somehow educate ourselves politically, and because actually we realized that we are active in a field in which very easily we are being instrumental for different interests, but we were not aware of that. So, judging on the history of contemporary art in Romania, we could see that all these processes, which we thought they are progressive, they were actually extremely reactionary. So, for instance, contemporary artists were made instruments for anti-communism in various instances during, I don't know, 20 years, and they were not even aware of this. So, in this kind of thinking patterns, we thought, okay, we need to organize in order to educate and to be a bit more reflexive, not to act immediately upon our desires. And one immediate consequence is that we started to think about our class position and I think I said it. I covered it all somehow.
Talk about the exhibition and who will come to the reading.
So because of this this whole educational process is we sensed that it's much more valuable when we did it together, like not on ourselves, but like when we were 3-4 people, it kind of any kind of discussion was more interesting because of the different sharing processes that took place in this little circle. We thought about building these groups of people that are active in the cultural scene, and together with them to create some kind of context in which also their works could, we could also reflect together on their own works, on our own works also. So we created this structure in which each group, reading group and seminar, is also accompanied by an exhibition. So we have two groups, one on the subject of rights and one on the subject of property, and each of them is accompanied by a homonymous, same name, exhibition, group exhibitions with people that somehow touched upon these issues, subjects. And our goal is to somehow create this more inclusive somehow space for discussing these works from a political point of view. And I think this is it. Thank you so much.
So because we have to go on the tour, I'll just quickly show you another kind of reading group. This we did about 250 interviews with war participants and anti-war activists in the last few years. And this is all audio recorded, not on video. And this was also a very interesting process of reading because, for instance, many of these human rights organizations that are looking for war criminals and victims, they mainly focus, when they do interviews with people, they mainly focus on they fix the time of the beginning of the war from the first bullet or from the time somebody experienced some war crime, or from the time they went into a camp or something like that. But we offered, methodologically, we created a different kind of interviews. First of all, because we didn't use experts. It was a peer-to-peer interview. So people were much more open, and we didn't press them to talk about the war itself. The interview only started with a question: when was the first time you felt or you realized that Yugoslavia could break up? And according to the age of the interviewee, it varied from the economical changes in the 60s to, of course, to the middle of the 90s. So even with this question of when is the beginning of the war, when is the beginning of the breakup of Yugoslavia, we already, with a simple question, shifted the reading of the wars. That's why I always hesitated already to call it a methodology, because this is activism. This is already creating a new consciousness in people to, of course, when they start to tell the history from that point, from that moment, when they get to the when they get to the late 80s and 90s, their story changes so much, and it's actually can be seen on, especially on people who we had some people that we interviewed that already gave interviews for the Hague Tribunal or for different NGOs, and when they were asked to give an interview, then one of the activists from Predo said, okay, I have 2 hours, let's do it. And I said, okay. And we sat, the first day we sat for 4 hours, and we didn't even get to the war. So suddenly the whole narrative becomes different. So this kind of, so in this situation, this simple act that academics would call methodological, becomes a political act. Now, we did a lot of, we did also a lot of roundtables and so on, and we did TV shows from it, programs, and we did radio programs. But what was interesting in the radio programs was that it was made out of sections of the interviews, only, without narration, without anything else. And then we came, and then we asked ourselves, okay, we're going to put this all on the internet. That's not a problem. And yes, but who exactly is going to sit and listen to 800 hours of interviews? Which is always a problem, because not only with our archives, it's a problem with all the testimony archives. Nobody has the patience to, and then I said, okay, let's take the same methodology we used for the radio programs. We'll now open it up to everybody making their own radio program. So we actually designed, this is not designed, we actually sit and we cut the interviews. I mean, you can listen to the whole interview, but we cut the interviews into sections of about 3 minutes, and we tag it, and then it's searchable, and people can choose 10 clips and make their own show. And then they can also add narration, I mean not narration, but they can add clips of their own, and not voiceover yet. We're still developing this technology. And what we got was already, because technologically people had to download somewhere these so-called, make a playlist somewhere. So we actually created profiles, so we could turn it very easily to a social network. So actually, this whole process became a very unique archive, which I can't show because there's no internet. But concerning reading, what I wanted to show was the tagging process, and because we have it also in English. As you can see, now this is I opened 2 interviews that should let you see. You know, because the artist in the exhibition also used it as kind of notes of what's in the interviews, it became more and more, from keywords it became more and more sentences. But the question, you know, of how do you choose the keywords? How do you choose the sentences? What do you choose? How do you do the time coding? All this is a part of reading. And there were a lot of discussion about this, and that went beyond, of course, the technological aspect of it. This became almost a kind of psychoanalytic process. So this kind of procedure and talking about it, and the fact that different people were doing it and we discussed it all the time, it became also a reading group, but a totally different kind of reading group. This is not really connected to the project in Yash, but I just wanted to show that reading has a very wide spectrum of functions. So thank you very much for listening. If anybody wants to ask, comment, discuss, please. Thank you.
I just want to thank you for the lecture, for the presentation. Actually, we somehow touched some of the subjects yesterday while we were drinking beer in this bar, right?
That's always a good...
We were not talking about war, but we actually did talk about contemporary art, possibilities, impossibilities, how we actually, I was talking how I need to get out from it, because I see it's not the field where I could somehow, that it takes me, that it somehow doesn't allow me everything that it centers. So it's very, very interesting for me, and actually I feel the same thing like the colleagues from Yash, also to somehow reflect various past experiences. We were talking yesterday at the conference also, for example, something that I tracked in Croatian context of contemporary art development of evolution from late 90s, for example, with this first wave of liberalization of 2000, for example, and then how we embraced this Western liberal discourse. In the same time, there was a third wave of privatization and all our banks were sold. So somehow we were just doing stuff without reflecting, and then the economic crisis of 2008 and occupation of universities somehow made also cultural workers to reflect what they're doing. And then somehow more and more we went into Yugoslav past, into past experience of our parents. We started to read like books that were actually totally dismissed in the 90s and the early 2000s. So I think that this what the people from Yash did is amazing step. And I think all of us should do this. And while you were telling this, Florin, when you were explaining the project, I was thinking, okay, I need to do this when I come back home. So I really, really like that you also named the things by their own names. I do feel that even, I try to use the contemporary art field where I am operating to somehow address these topics, but very often I get weird somehow, it's a sort of censorship, it's even self-censorship that happens. So anyway, I think we should talk about this much, much more, and starting from our own positions and analyzing our own role in the field. I just caught this topic because it's really, really something that we were discussing for the last 2 days. But thank you for the presentation. I really learned a lot. Not learned, but somehow repeated certain stuff. I was empowered. Does anybody else have questions? Because it's really, I wrote like 2 pages of talk for 2 hours. There is no time to go to Jordana and
Yeah, maybe through the takes time to digest.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you.